Okay, so this will be part 1 of the Game Art for Beginners, also known as Modeling 1, which is what it was called when it was a class that I taught at a real school. And it'll essentially be prop modeling in 3ds Max, as that's how we usually start people out in 3D, making, just everyday objects to a point with UVs and textures, stuff that can be in a game. So if you don't have Max, you'll need to go to Autodesk's website, to their education section. If I were you, I would just Google Autodesk Educational. And then when you're on this page, you can hit free software and you can go to 3ds Max. Now I'm using 2018 because all of my plugins work with it. It's a very solid build. You could use a different one if you want to. They'll probably let you pick from 2017 to 2020 or 2018 to 2020 when you download this, but I'm using 18 as it's just, I don't feel like upgrading. I actually have 19 and I didn't like it very much. It's just a little bit different. It doesn't look much different. It just performed differently on my machine. So get whatever version you want. Even if you have 2020, the stuff I'm going over should be 99% the same. So once you get that, come back into Max and we'll talk about how to do all this stuff. We're pretty much going to go over the basics of movement, how to use the menus, and the command panel, which is the primary menu. Today we'll be beating you over the head with as much information as possible. Don't get freaked out by it because I just go over it intensely. Then we build something. And then when the other classes start, we start slower and go back over the same stuff we did on day 1, but where you can actually understand why it's being done and kind of how it's being done. Okay, so the first tip I'll tell you is if you don't see this command panel, you can right-click up in this dark gray area up here and go to command panel. And there that is. It is important, but the primary things you're going to see are a bunch of menus up here and 4 screens labeled top, front, left, and perspective. Now, top, front, and left are orthographic views or 2-dimensional views with no perspective distortion. This is very normal for 3D. I, however, do not use the traditional way that some people build things, which is they select a side view and then go into that view and change something and then go into a different view. I tend to use one viewport. Now, you can change your viewport settings over here to have different layouts. I'm not going to go over that because I just don't do it. You can have like one big one and 2 small ones, but I like to have just one. It's very easy for me. So the way that you maximize a viewport is you select whichever one you want. So you can middle mouse click on these 4 viewports and you see the yellow outline around them. Now what I always do is use a perspective one. So the first shortcut you're going to hear, and if you want to take notes, go ahead, is Alt-W. That's for maximize window, probably for window, Alt-W. Now we'll talk about movement. Now I'm going to have to jump between a couple of different theories here, like camera movement, object movement, different things, just to show you stuff, because once I get to a certain point, I won't have anything to demonstrate with, and that gets kind of difficult. So camera movement. If you want to pan the camera, just like kind of move it left to right, that's just middle mouse. Your cursor will turn into a hand like that. So that's panning. If you want to zoom in and out, it's left, or scroll wheel, just in and out. If you're okay with that kind of clunky zoom, that's an incremental zoom. You can change that in the settings, but by default it's set this way. So for a smooth zoom, you actually have to hold Alt and Control, and then click down middle mouse and push forward or backwards. And you get this smooth zoom. Now, turning the camera, you hold Alt and middle mouse. So, if I'm trying to get that black X centered, I'm holding middle mouse to pan, and then hold Alt, turn it around. I use a combination of these things all the time. Zoom in and out, turn, and pan. So, once more, turning the camera, hold Alt and push down middle mouse. Zooming in, hold Control Alt, push down middle mouse, push forward on the mouse or backwards. And panning is just middle mouse. So, those views that you saw before, these 3 other views, I get to them by using their shortcuts. Now, they only have the other 3 views that are default. You can set other views. So, for example, they only have top, left, and front. Now, there's no right and there's no back. You do have the ability to set shortcuts for that. Now I'm going to build something real quick, so I have to jump into a later part of the lecture, so to speak, to build something. I'm just going to build this teapot here. I'll zero that out. We'll talk about that in a second. So now there's something here. And yes, this is a primitive in Max because the first object ever rendered was a pot in 3D. So the way that I get to those views, if we go back out here, you can see they have the views. But what I do is use the shortcuts, which is L for left. Yes, I know it's the front, but it's because I built it in the wrong direction. F for front, and T for top. Now you can see that some of these are in wireframe. The way you turn on the polygons to see them is F3. Another shortcut you're going to need to know. So I'll go back to front, F3, L, it's correct, T, it's correct, and P for perspective. Now if you want to see your wireframe mesh at the same time, you can hit F4 and that'll turn those on. So now I have wireframe and polygons. So that's F3 and F4. You can toggle that stuff whenever you want. You'll also see it change up here, and you can do those exact same things in here. So they're just hotkeys for changing this stuff here. There's one other type of view that we'll talk about more later, but it's called orthographic perspective. And that shortcut is U. And if you ever see your grid go on infinitely like this, instead of a cute little one here, you're in orthographic perspective. And if you've ever played any games that are in isometric view, like let's say RTS games like Command & Conquer, they're technically in orthographic perspective, which means it's not a true perspective view. Some people find it easier to build this way. It drives me crazy, so just hit P if it ever looks that way. The way that you get there is, let's say you're in left view and you're doing something, and you turn the camera into a perspective view, it'll automatically be stuck in orthographic perspective. Now you would just hit P to get back into a proper perspective. So that's pretty much camera movements. If you want, you can Alt-W back out of the view that you're in. See, now I've ruined whatever view that was. So I've got top and front, so this is technically left. But I literally, once I start a project, I never leave my main window. So I just Alt-W on one, doesn't matter which one, and then I just use those shortcuts to pop between them. Now R does other things in Max, so that's why it's not the right view hotkey. Also, it's just a thing in all 3D packages that left is your basic side view. So in my shortcuts, I normally set the right view to Control R. I don't have that set on this, I don't think. No, this is the tool that's actually meant for that shortcut, which is Orbit. Let's get out of there. Okay, so other things. Movement. We'll have to talk about the basic movement in 3D, which is move, rotate, and scale. So there's a bit to go into on that. So to select the object, you just single click on it. Now, I have this horrible yellow wireframe. When I click on it, it goes white. Now, I'll normally put materials on my object so that I don't have such a similar thing. I'll have black edges, and then when I click on them, they're white. It's much easier to see. But we'll get into materials later. So to move the thing, you'll see this widget here. Now, this has Z up, Y, and X. Now, that is a 3ds Max thing. If you've done any other 3D, sometimes you'll see Y up. Maya has Y up. But a lot of things use Z up. Some use Y up. The theory behind it is that if you know a traditional graph, X and Y, are you looking at it on the floor or the wall? If you're looking at the XY grid on the floor, the natural up is Z. If you're looking at it on a wall in front of you, then the depth towards the wall is Z. And that's actually normally in a game engine, they call it Z depth, and they're using that theory. But you'll see this widget, and you can see that it's highlighting the stems of the arrows, shafts of the arrows, I guess you call it. So if you want, you can grab the blue arrow, and now you're only moving it in Z. I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. That is the same as in every other program. Here I'm moving it on X and on Y. Now I'm only grabbing one at a time. Now you can see you can grab the little like connector box between the two, and now I can move it on X and Y, or X and Z if I can grab that box. Come on, man, I just can't see the angle right. There we go. Normally you wouldn't. If you're going to move something, let's say you're going to move it in one view, probably just sort of pull it up or something. Certain things are better done in perspective, and certain things are better done in orthographic. But it should be relatively easy to move things. It's just we tend to always grab one axis at a time because it's a little bit crazy to move things like this. So let's move. Not too bad. Also mentioning right away that down here, and I'm going to use kind of my ghetto shortcut here, so forgive me. Let's see. Oops, not that. There we go. It's the Windows plus shortcut. So if you look down in your screen, you should see X, Y, and Z. So I'm not sure if that came through on there, so I'm actually just going to make sure you can see it here. X, Y, and Z right here. X, Y, and Z. And so that is, depending on what you're doing, like so if I'm in move right now, if you can see I'm moving it in the Y, and the Y numbers are going up and back down. If I move it in Z, same. So what that means is if I ever want to move it, 15, right now it's in centimeters, I want to move it 15 centimeters in X, I just type in 15, or I can click on these little, I don't remember what they call these, but these little arrows here, I can move it that way as well. And if I right click on these arrows, it'll zero everything out. So if I have it in a crazy place where I move it in X and Z and Y, I come back here and I right click on all three of those, it'll zero them out. So that's kind of fun. That's all just movement. So now rotate. So that was W for move. That is the universal move shortcut in any 3D program other than Blender. So the next one next to it is E, that is rotate. So rotate works very similarly. You see this sphere. Now you have this big white one on the outside, and you have blue, green, and red again. So if I want to rotate it just on Y, I grab that one and I can rotate it just on Z, just on X. Now the white one normally rotates it to camera, and rotating to camera is nonsense. I never do that. So in general, if I'm rotating things, I have to turn on my snaps, because rarely when you're building something, especially modular level design or something, do you want to just have random numbers. So I just rotated this thing down a little bit, and I have 14.411 in Y rotation. That's positive. So we're going to talk about snaps real quick. So if you come up in this menu up here, you'll see you have 4 icons up here with orange magnets on them. This one looks like a 3, this one looks like a speed square, a percentage, and spinners. That's what they call those little arrows, okay? So angle snap toggle is this guy here that has kind of the speed square looking thing. The shortcut for that is A. You can see when I hit A, turns it on and off. Now, it's a little bit intense, but we'll go in there right away. If you right click on this, it'll take you to your grid and snap settings. This is actually the settings for a ton of different things, but it takes you to the tab that you're on, which is angle snaps. So right here it says angle 5. So most of my professional life, I've gone between 5 and 11.25 and 25, like just varying. It depends on the kind of things you're making. I know 11.25 might seem weird, but I'll show you why I use it. It has to do with 45-degree angles. Like I can get 11.25, 22.5, 33.75, and 45. Now, normally that's going to cover most of what I need for like really simple shapes. I don't need any remainders. I need solid numbers. And 11.25 just breaks up 45-degree angles, so this is decent. You won't go crazy. And if you do need something intense, you'll normally rotate it close. Let's say I rotated it that much, and I can toggle off my angle snaps and then kind of nudge it into place. That tends to be how I do things. So that's rotate. There you can see I'm in orthographic perspective again, so I'll hit P for perspective. Okay, so that's rotate. It's not as complicated. Move and rotate are relatively simple. Again, all of my rotational data was down here, and I can rotate on one thing at a time. Down in here, or I can type it in. I want to rotate 45 degrees that way. I can right-click and zero it out. So rotate, not so bad. Now the next one, the main thing that you do in 3D is scale. Now it's R for scale. Now this one does get complicated. So what I need you to look at is come up here on the screen, and when I hit W for move, you see that I have select and move highlighted. When I hit E for rotate, I have select and rotate selected. And those are the only two options. So if I hit E a number of times, it doesn't do anything. It just keeps it selected. Now R, when I have it selected, you can see right there it says select in uniform scale. If I hit R again, it changes to select a non-uniform scale. If I hit R again, it changes to select and squash. And if I hit R again, I'm back to select a uniform scale. Now, to show you those more easily, if you left click and hold, these are the 3 different types of scale. Might not seem like a big deal, but it's a huge frickin' deal. So, select in uniform scale. I'm going to grab the middle first, because that's how you actually normally scale. And you can just make something bigger or smaller. The thing is, though, you can grab X, Y, or Z just like you did before, and you can scale it up in just Z, and you can see how you're starting to deform the shape quite badly. Now, one thing you'll notice down here is that you can't right-click and zero these out because they get sort of lost. Like, it'll record it. Right now I'm going in Z by 216%, but I can't right-click on it because I'm in this uniform scale. It just doesn't work that way. So like now this is its 100% scale, so I can undo it, but it's a little harder to fix scale changes. So if I do that, either any one of these will just scale in that, and normally we never do this, by the way. Scaling a intact object more than a little is very, very bad. So this one will most of the time work the same way. Select the non-uniform scale. It's not a big problem. The one that is a problem is, what do they call this one? Select and squash. Now this one works like an animation scale. So it takes the entire mass of the shape and redistributes it within the scale. So if I scale it lower, it's going to push it out like it's being stepped on, or thin it out like it's being pulled upwards. That's normally when you notice something is wrong. You're like, oh, I want to scale this, and it goes, you know, you're like, that's terrible. Just go back up here, either hit R again for scale, or left click and hold and go to the top one. That's scaling for the most part. Just means changing size. Again, if you're down in here, only the X one is highlighted for you to be able to scroll the spinner, to click and push. Another quick thing to note about Max is that if I go past the screen with my cursor, it'll come back up the bottom, and I can go indefinitely. That's kind of interesting. When we're in the other scale mode, though, select the non-uniform, then it gives me the spinners for all 3 dimensions, and the same with the squash one. So the kind of the standard one only has X highlighted here. So that's move, rotate, and scale. Those are your 3 basic things that you do with objects. It has nothing to do with sub-objects, which is like things that make stuff up. We'll get into that in a little bit. So that's the very, very basics of how to get around. You should be able to move the camera. You can't build an object yet because we didn't get into that, so let's do that. I'm going to delete that. So undo's, if I didn't mention, is Control Z, and delete is delete. So these are all universal things. So the command panel, let's get into this guy a little bit. So the command panel is super confusing to new people. So you have 6 tabs up here, and then you have like these sub tabs, and you have this drop down menu, and then you have whatever is in that menu. So don't let that kind of worry you. The main thing that you need to keep an eye on is that right now I'm in the Create tab. It's this plus sign. The main ones you're going to hang out in are Create and Modify. Now Modify, it looks like it's got 4 vertices and like a little angle in there. And then this robot looking thing is the Hierarchy tab. Then we have, what do they call this one? Motion. Yeah, I don't use this because I'm not an animator. We have Display, which we use somewhat. And then we have Utilities. But these are all very specific things. Primarily, you're going to use Create and Modify. Now, within Create, you're normally going to use the one that it's already on, which is Geometry. You also have Shapes, which are lines, like vector shapes. They're not geometry so much as like 2-dimensional shapes. And you have Lights, which I don't do much of in these classes. Cameras, Helpers, which is hard to explain to absolutely new people, but some stuff that's useful. Space warps, which I know sounds really weird. We use that in simulations quite a bit. And then systems. And the only system I've used consistently in these classes is the biped, which I will set to a height of a in-game character, so that if somebody's building a prop, they can pull a biped in. since I don't do any kind of like rigging or animation. So back in geometry, you'll see in this drop-down, you've got standard primitives, extended primitives, compound objects, particle systems, patch grids, body objects, doors, and so on. I don't need to read all of this. None of this is basic stuff. A lot of this is very extensive, experienced stuff, moderate, or, to experienced people. For this class, we're going to stick in geometry and shapes and leave it in standard primitives or sometimes compound objects. We have things like lofts and booleans in here. If you don't know what that is, you will later. But so for geometry, we'll stick in geometry, standard primitives. Now you have box, sphere, cylinder, torus, teapot, text plus, cone, geosphere, tube, pyramid, and plane. I'm a box modeler. Now that means that I build 99% of what I build out of boxes. So let's use that as the first thing we're going to try to build. You're just going to click on box. Now you'll already see a bunch of parameters down here. Now you can worry about that now or later. We're going to worry about it later. We're just going to build a box. Now I'm going to try to the best of my abilities to see these 4 squares in the grid. And I'm going to grab this corner here and just drag it out to the kitty corner over there. Now that's with holding left click. Then you let go of that left click. Now you need to pull up in Z and then press left click again. That's how you build an object. Try it a bunch of times if you want. Hold left click, draw it out, let go, build the Z, click again. Now you've got something. Now you need to right click to kind of disengage it. But as it is, now here's something to keep in mind. When I'm building it, click on box. I build the box. Once I've built it, I still have these parameters here. Now I've got length, width, height, and length segments, width segments, height segments. Generate mapping coordinates and real-world map size. Don't worry about those at the moment. We also have keyboard entry, which we can expand, which is basically you just plug in how big you want it to be, and then hit create, and it'll pop in there. But right now, what a lot of modelers will do is they don't want to leave, again, these kind of remainder numbers. So right now, my length, height, and width are all kind of close to 20. We got 19.57, 19.722, 17.041. Normally, we just go in and make them all 20, for instance. And now it's a perfect square. It's probably not on 0, which everything should be normally, but at least it's clean. Once I right-click, all that's gone. Unless I go to the Modify tab, and now it's all there again, and I can still change the parameters. Now this is called parametric geometry, which means that I can change how many segments it has, I can change its size, all just by clicking in the command panel. This is how everything comes in. So I'll build a couple more things here. A sphere will start from the center and just come out like that. Now if I go into the Modify thing, since I already clicked off of it, it gives me the size, and it gives me the segments of the sphere. And I can also turn it into a hemisphere if I want. Like how much of a hemisphere do I want it to be? 50% will go halfway, or 0.5 in this case. So it's like 0.25 would be a quarter of it's gone. 0.5 is half of it gone, and so on. It's not too hard to understand that. Sometimes you may want a shape like that. But that's the parameters of a sphere. A cylinder is going to be built the same way as a cube. So you draw out the radius, you let go, you push up the height. So over here it gives us radius choices. So let's correct that to a straight 16. I'll make the height like 40. Now right now it has 5 height segments. Maybe I only wanted 1 because I'm not going to do much with that. But I wanted it to have more sides. Right now it's at 18. Let's say I want 24 sides. You can see that more from the top. So I just hit T for top. So I can really turn up the side count. Now I can really pull it down. It all depends on what you want to do with it. If you want to make a hexagon, you're actually going to make a 6-sided cylinder. You're not going to make a hexagon. So those are the parameters that come with cylinder. A torus. A torus is like a donut. So really they're going to give you, you're going to build out the first radius, the second radius, and then you're done. And you can again go in and you can kind of twist its rotation. You can change the radii. whatever that is. You can change how many sides it has, how many segments it has, which will affect how round it is, how smooth it is, and some other things. So that's a torus. We'll go, again, we have the teapot, which you're never going to use unless you're teaching a class and you just need an object in the scene. Text plus is literally just text that you can put in 3 dimensions. Yeah. There you go. You may need 3-dimensional text for some stuff. I don't know if you will. I don't use it. I tend to do all of my text work in texturing. So a cone is a cylinder where they give you an option to taper the end of it so that when you build it, you're like 1, 2, 3. Now when I'm doing that, it's like click and drag, let go, push up. I'm not holding on any buttons. Click again, not holding on any buttons. Click again. Oops, I skipped geosphere. A geosphere is all triangles instead of all quads like our other sphere was. I don't ever use geospheres. A tube is a cylinder that's already hollowed out. Normally I would just do that by hand. I've never actually used a tube. Pyramid is like you would think it is. Most people I know don't actually use that primitive either. However, they do all the time use a plane. Now the plane is just like you're drawing a box, but you just click and drag it out and that's it. Now I do use the parameters on this one quite a bit because as you can see it comes with 4 segments and I normally only want it to have 1, so I'll right click on the spinners for each one. So those are your basic primitives. I know it might seem silly to show all of them to you. Primarily what you're going to need to use is box, cylinder, and plane. I know some people that keep box, cylinders, and planes in their scenes just to drag them over. Okay, so I'm going to build a box and we're going to start talking about how to actually make stuff. All right, so let me make sure I'm going over this as slowly as possible because you are new people. Click and drag out, let go, push up on Z, click again. I'm going to come over here and correct this to 20s. Actually, let me show you a keyboard entry real quick just to demonstrate it. If I just typed in 20, 20, 20. Oops, did that wrong. Oops, I put that in the position. Mistakes are fun. I will leave all of these in the video because it happens that way. Alright, so 20, 20, 20. Now you've got the perfect cube and it comes in on 0, which is different than if you build it the other way. Okay, so now a bunch of more stuff we got to get into. So quickly, I'm going to look up into this menu because you kind of just got to get this stuff out of the way. You have undo and redo, which is Control Z, and Shift Z, I believe, is the shortcut for redo. Now you have select and link and unlink. We're not going to get into them right away. And bind to space warp. Again, that's a simulation thing. Select object is a very simple thing. Select by name. We don't have anything named yet. Right now we have box 001, but if I wanted to select that guy, there you go. Now, rectangular selection and window crossing. Rectangular selection is your default selection mode, where it means that anytime that my rectangular marquee box here crosses the geometry, I select it. Window crossing means that I need to completely encapsulate the object to grab it. I don't use window crossing, but if you're ever like working on, you know, like standard stuff where you're trying to like really get a specific selection, you keep grabbing the wrong thing, you may want to use window crossing. We've already talked about select and move, select and rotate, and the different types of scaling. Now select and place is a weird one. It seems a little early to show that, but I'll show it. So we need to talk about duplication right away. So the way you duplicate something in Max is, well, there's a couple ways, but the way that I like to do it is if you hold shift, you can just drag out a duplicate and it'll ask you copy instance or reference. We're going to say copy. And I'm going to scale it down, which is R, and you scale them down. Now I'm going to use these two boxes to demonstrate select in place. So if you click on select in place, you can grab this guy here, and he will conform to the surface of the other object. You can't really tell that he's conforming because everything's a square. But how it works is that every polygonal face and vertex has something called a face normal, which just means there's an imaginary line that shoots out of all of the faces and all of the verts. And in this case, the origin of this object, as you can see, is on the bottom, which is how Max works. A lot of 3D packages put it in the center. On the bottom's actually good for this purpose. It's basically where the face normal would be on that, in the bottom polygon. So as we use this, it just connects that to this one. So it's neat, but it's not particularly useful. So I'm going to delete that guy. So we don't use him a whole lot. Let me get off of him. Okay, so we've got the different view options. Now this is important. Again, just remember, I will go back over all of this later, but so these different options up here, we got view, screen, world, parent, local, gimbal, grid, working, and local aligned. The ones you need to worry about are view, screen, and local primarily. So what view is what you're normally in, and that means that when I rotate this guy, he's being rotated in view mode. So he's using like the world's axis to rotate him from. So when I rotate this guy, let me turn my angle snaps on. He rotates that way. And as you can see, the rotate widget stays with the world. Now if I change this to local, it goes to the axis of him. So like his pivot point kind of dictates, which is created when he's built, it dictates where the rotation can happen from. So this is really useful if you have an object that you want to rotate. And as you can see, when there's nothing on him, local is the same as view. But if I wanted to rotate him and then I needed to spin him, that works well that way. If I'm in view mode and I rotate him this way, there's really no easy way for me to rotate him on his own axis because all I have to work with is the world's coordinates. Now those are the big ones. Screen can give you some really weird effects because it's adjusting based on how you're looking at it. So primarily view is the world coordinates and local is the object's coordinates. These are also called object coordinates at times. Those are the only two I would worry about. World is also literally there, but it's the same thing as view in this particular software. Use pivot point center. I don't use a whole lot. That has to do with something we're not going to do for a while. Select and manipulate is something I've honestly not used. So this one is incredibly important. Keyboard shortcut override toggle. If this is off, like a lot of your stuff won't work. So if you're ever doing like shortcuts and they're not working, check this guy out and see if he's there. So, all right, now we're moving on to snaps. Snaps toggle, angle snap toggle, percent snap toggle, and spinner snap toggle. Now, I'm pretty sure all of this is the exact same menu. When you right click on these, you're getting the exact same menu with just different places. So the percentage of snaps on the spinners you can change the angle. And in here, in the snaps tab, you can change what you're snapping to. So you can see right now it says vertex, that's what I normally use. Let's change it to grid points and turn off vertex. And then I hit S for snaps toggle. And you can see this little crosshair. And if I move him, it'll select these grid points. And I'm moving him just on the grid. Let me go to the top view, you can see that. You know, it makes it much easier to perfectly move something. So when you're doing modular level design, you may decide that each component you have is a particular size, and you'll need to move them around and snap them to exact places easily. Okay, so F3 back there. P for perspective. Now that's actual snaps. Now I don't use grid snaps a whole lot, so I'm going to turn off my snaps. The percentage snaps, again, that's if you want to change what percentage these things are moving at. You can play around with all this stuff. Pretty much the ones you're going to need are S and A snaps and angle snaps. And I normally keep it on vertex snaps and my angle set to 11.25 on and off. Selection sets we'll go into later. Mirror is interesting. So if you have something built, you can try this. If you don't, build something real quick. If I click on mirror, it gives me which axis am I going to do. I'm going to select Z, which means below it. And as you can see, mine moves. It basically just rotates it down. But if I hit copy, it creates a duplicate underneath it. And that's what you would think it would do. Now, it has copy, instance, or reference. We should talk about those, and we will when we get into modifying things. Align is super important. Let's hold shift and duplicate our cube. And so to align, I would hold alt and hit A, and I get this kind of little icon here. If I click on my cube, it'll align it to the X, Y, and Z position, and now it's exactly on top of my other cube, which might be very, very handy when you're trying to get things to where you can get them to work together. Let's say like cylindrical bits when you're trying to build out something like a gun barrel. If one of them is like down here and over here, and I'm going to scale it this way, and I want them to line up, I could align it on the axes that I need. Let's say it's X and Z in this case. Now, one thing you'll notice, I can't center them into each other because both of their pivots are on the bottom. So if I did want to do that, I'd have to move their pivot points, which we'll get into in a little bit. So that demonstration didn't work perfectly. But align is super important. All right, so here we go. Toggle Scene Explorer and toggle Layer Explorer. Couple things about these. Number one, you can accidentally get them docked into your UI, and they're incredibly hard to get out. Number two, one of these I absolutely hate, and the other one I love. And I believe Layer Explorer is superior. So I don't use Scene Explorer. You can see all these icons here. I'm not real familiar with this one because they added it a while back. So Layer Explorer, what I use it for is create new layers, add to active layer, all these things, hide all layers. Really, really good for managing a scene. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do with the Scene Explorer, so when I do stuff with you, I'll be using this. So Layer Explorer is awesome. Now the ribbon. Okay, we don't have the ribbon yet necessarily. It says toggle ribbon, and it's, well, okay, it's here. You can see it, but it's not doing anything. This whole thing turns into a giant menu. Curve editor, we're not going to use in this class. Schematic view, we're not going to use in this class. Material editor, yes, we will. You can click that button if you want. Otherwise, you can hit the letter M to open that. Now, what I'll normally do is have it open and minimize it. And then when I just hit M, it'll come back up. We'll use that in a moment. All right, so you've got render setup, render frame window, render production, render in the cloud. We're not going to use any of that. Autodesk A360 gallery, not going to touch that. Auto grid, measure distance, and array. These are what are called the extras, which are on mine, so I can turn them off. So yours will probably look like this. And to get them there, you just right-click and go to extras, and they'll either pop up there or they'll pop up as a floating window, and you can drag them up there. They're very, very important. For the sake of sanity, I'm going to drag this off to my other screen. Do you see how right there, what it wants to do? It wants to dock that there. Don't let it do that, because it'll mess your stuff up. All right. So that's a decent overview of what's going on. Hopefully you're not terribly bored yet. I'm not sure how far into this we are, but all right, so we got to get into how things work. So you're going to select this cube. Now let's make it look like a more suitable cube. So I'm going to hit M again. I'm going to show you how I do things. So it's still a parametric box, but it's frickin' blue, and I hate blue. So what I do, I'm going to click on the blue square next to box 1. I'm I'm also going to rename it so that you can see how to do that. We'll name it demo box underscore low, even though we're not going to have a high or anything. It's just good naming conventions. If I click on the little blue box next to its name, this popped up on my other screen, and I'm going to select black. That's going to make everything black. Now the edges and the polygons. Now that's not really acceptable because I can't see anything when I'm doing my edges. So then what I do is in the material editor that we have open, don't worry, it's incredibly massive, but you don't need to do anything with it right now. You're just going to look for in scanline standard, click and drag that out. And this is a node-based system. You're just going to take the output and drag it into the viewport and put it on your object. So that's how a civilized person models, with black edges and a material on their stuff. Now, maybe you have a preference for what your material should look like. Mine normally, I just click on, you can double click on this material, and you get ambient, diffuse, and specular. Yes, we're getting a little advanced here, but calm yourself. If you click on the diffuse color, you'll get a color picker. What I normally do is just turn it down in the value, give it a little bit more gray. And that's literally how I work on everything. Sometimes when I'm doing a complex object, I'll create slightly different hues of gray so that I can see things, like the body of the vehicle is gray, but the details are like a bluish gray, just so because those will be my texture sets later. But for right now, all you need to do is drag on a gray. You can even just do the basic standard, I don't care. It's not like I can give you crap for it because I can't see what you're doing. So I close that. So now I have a standard box and I named it demo box. So what you'll see here, I probably need to turn this off. Where do I even do that? It's been a long time. These shortcuts here are important. Here we go. Okay, show buttons. So yours probably looks like this when you're in the Modify tab. Remember, we created here. Now you're in Modify. So if you want to see some modifiers, you click on Configure Modifier Sets and then Show Buttons. And it'll probably give you some default ones, which we can worry about all those later. Modifiers aren't really in my initial lecture. So, but it's just, I feel wrong when I can't see them. So here's the big thing about 3ds Max. We've been working with parametric geometry. And right now you're going to right click on your object. You're going to get this big menu right here with all kinds of stuff that should be very intimidating, and that's whatever. Some of it's simple stuff like move, rotate, scale, but some of it dope sheet, lots of stuff that you're not going to use. You're going to go down to the bottom and go to convert to, and then convert to editable poly. We're always going to use editable poly in my classes, not editable mesh. Now, when you did that, let's undo and watch. Watch the Modify tab. Right-click, convert to editable poly. And this entire menu changes now. So this is no longer parametric. I can't change how many segments it has. I can't do any of that stuff. And also, look up here in the ribbon when I do it. Right-click, convert to editable poly. Keep your eye on that ribbon. See all the giant menus that just popped up here? And that's one tab of the ribbon. The ribbon has multiple tabs. All right, so we got to talk about sub-object mode. This is an object. Our object is called demobox underscore low. The sub-objects of said object are the vertex, edges, borders, polygons, and elements. So the shortcuts for those, hopefully you're writing some of this down, are 1 for vertex, 2 for edges, 3 for borders, and you can see where I'm going. 4 for polygons, or I will often say faces. That's a Maya term. I did Maya in college, so I just still use that term. And 5 for elements. Borders and elements are exclusive to Max as far as I know. So hit 1, and you will see that there are now blue squares on every connection of edges. So what a vertex is the point where edges intersect. The edge is obviously the edge. A border is open edges. A polygon is obviously the face between the edges and the verts. And the element is actually just kind of a mesh segment. So you can grab a vertex and push it around just like we did before in whatever axis you want to. And you can hit number 2 and grab an edge. We don't have any borders, but if you want to hit 4 for polygons, that's how you select polygons. Now, this is how you actually build stuff. And then element number 5 will grab everything because it's all one cohesive mesh. So how I normally do this, and if you look, when we're in standard, if you hit 1 again, you'll turn it off. So 1, you're in vertex mode, 1, you turn it off. Again, look up at the ribbon. If you hit 1, you get way more options, and they're all specific to vertex selection or modification. You hit 1 again, that goes back to a standard menu for objects. Now here's another thing, this command panel. When we're in this, I can stretch it out. It's probably going to freak out on me a little bit because it tends to. But you can see I have these little menus that have been hidden, and it can get really intense. So to have all of it showing, it actually takes up an entire another monitor. So normally I have this background on one screen, and then the other stuff is on my other screen. So while I'm doing these recordings, I'm going to have to kind of keep this as minimal as I can, a few apart. Like I'm not going to use soft selection yet, so I don't need that. It will freak out once in a while, so well, let's make it too wide so you can see some stuff. So if I hit 1 again, what I want to point out is that everything that's in this ribbon up here, which used to be a plugin made by someone else, is also going to be available within the command panel menu. It's just like, which menu do you prefer to dive in? Do you want this version with the pretty icons, or do you want the old school Max version with just gray buttons with white words? It's really up to you. So, like for example, you know, let's find an area to show you. So edit vertices, you've got remove, break, extrude, weld, chamfer, target, weld, connect. Most of those are going to be up here: extrude, chamfer, weld, remove, break, target, weld. And then you've got a few more things. You've got some crease weights, that's right here, weight and crease. So you've got these kind of hidden menus here. But all it is, so like this is called the edit geometry menu down here. So right now it just says geometry all, but if you look down here, it says edit geometry. Essentially, this is all the same stuff. Excuse me. So don't be too afraid. Just pick one that you want to use. There's a few tools that won't be available in both. For instance, Swift Loop, which is really important, is only in the ribbon, and I don't know why. They never added it to the command panel menu. So I use a combination of both, really. But let's go through the basic edit options of each of these sub-objects. I know it's going to feel a little bit intense, but like I said, it'll all make sense in the end. We're going to use just these basic things here. So like you would think, if I have select a vertex and I say remove, it's gone. Now my mesh has collapsed. This is what's called non-manifold geometry. It can't physically exist. It's terrible. So not all tools are good to be used. The shortcut for that, and there is one, is Alt Backspace. That is handy at times because if you hit just backspace, it just removes the vert, but Alt Backspace like cleanly removes the vert. You can't see it on just a cube, but trust me, later it'll matter. So the next one we'll talk about is break. So if I grab a vert and I hit break, what was one vertex, and you can see right down here in the command panel, it says vertex 8 selected. If I hit break and I deselect it now, when I click on it, there's 9, 10, there's multiple verts there. If I get in real close to them, whoop, not that close, I can actually pull the mesh apart. Where there once was one vertex, there's now 3. I've just broken the mesh. I don't use break very often, except for very specific circumstances, but it's good to know it's there. Extrude a vertex. Now here's the first time we'll see one of these menus. You've got the word extrude in a box, and then you've got a box next to it for settings. So there's extrude and extrude settings. If you just click extrude, you need to come over to the vert and click and push it, and it'll actually create an extrusion. By the way, extruding a vertex is something that you never do, so I'm not even sure why that tool's there. But just for example, is it not welded? Okay, I'll fix that in a second. Well, I might as well tell you guys how I did it. So because it was still 3 separate vertices, and I needed to demo something else, I just drew a box around it and I hit weld over here, which welded it back together into one vert. So that's going to be the next tool anyway, so you might as well see it. And then another way to show it to you is if I move it apart again, like this, and I grab all 3 verts and I want to weld them together, I can hit the settings next to weld, and it gives me this little menu. Whoops. You can move these menus. It didn't let me that time. There you go. It's the weld threshold tolerance. So if I click and push this up, it'll eventually pull verts from farther away to weld together. It's giving me an error there. It's not actually doing what I want. There it goes. But that'll also stay. So if I set that weld tolerance super high, now it's just stuck there. Whatever settings you set in max, it'll keep until you change them. I'm going to go back until I have a pretty box again, and then just weld that back together. So never extrude a vert. That's silly. Chamfer, which is a woodworking term, if you just click the button and then click and push on the vert, it creates a chamfered corner, which basically is, it's like a bevel, but slightly different. A chamfer is like an angle cut. So you can see what it's doing. That's a chamfer, literally. And there's also settings. So if I go to chamfer settings, I can decide how big that chamfer is and whether or not it's open. An open chamfer will leave a gap in between where we're chamfering. And then connect is a really important one. So let's grab this vertex here, and then we're going to hold control and grab this vertex. So control has how you grab multiple objects. Probably should have mentioned that sooner. And then if I hit connect, it'll draw a edge between them. That's what connected means. So you're not going to need to remember all of this immediately, but it'll come back to you when we do it. So let's go into edges real quick. We're going to have very, very similar tools. Let's see. Edit edges. Okay. So we can insert verts along the edges if we needed to, which we don't need to right now. I need to go into vert mode to make sure they're gone. We can remove an edge, just like before. Now I see there, it removes it, but the polygons are still intact. But if I hold control backspace, it'll remove the edge and all of the kind of structure around said edge. So that's how you cleanly remove it. Split works the same way as break. If you split an edge, it's no longer connected to itself. It should pull apart. I don't think I can do it with these polygons intact, so I'd actually have to delete them, grab this guy, split him, and then now he should lift away. Yeah, there he goes. Very specific times you may use that. Edge extrusion, again, I do not recommend it. We normally only extrude polygons, but extrusions are something that kind of comes out of something else. If you're not familiar with that term, they use it in plastics a lot. So weld works the same way. You're just connecting them together. You do have to have adequate circumstances for that as well. You can't just weld. Like if I grab these 2 edges and try to tell it to weld, it's probably not going to work because there's stuff in the way. Again, if I remove these polygons and I wanted these things attached to each other, I could do it, I think. Again, you can tell that I don't do this much. No, it's still not working. I've seen it done, but I don't use weld much on edges. Chamfer edges we use a lot. Like, that's a great tool. So here's it's a better chamfer. So let's grab this edge, and I'm going to hit chamfer settings. I can set the size and how many segments the chamfer has, so you can create a really round shape. We've got a couple other things here. Open, whether or not you want it to smooth where the chamfer is, that matters to some extent. Like, here. That's what it would look like if it didn't smooth the chamfer. You normally want it to smooth it. Chamfer edges is a great, great tool. Target weld is an amazing tool, which I don't know why I didn't go over in the other one. I don't think, maybe I just didn't have the adequate stuff to do it. I'm going to jump back to verts and make sure that I show that to you. So if I'm in vertex mode and I want to target weld something, I normally get there by right-click target weld. I'm going to click on it here so you can see that it's there. But target weld would be that I grab this vert and I take him to this vert and he welds there. Now that broke the shape, but that's what target weld does. It literally says you will become one with wherever I take you. It's an amazing tool. So you can apparently do it with edges. I don't do it much. All right, so there's a few really important ones in here. So let's say bridge. Okay, so to bridge edges, that's this next guy here. I would grab two edges and hit bridge, and it would create a bridge between them, like you would think. There's a number of ways to close a face, but that's one example. And to connect edges, if I click that, it's going to cut it directly in half with an edge. That's a really, really handy trick. Now, what we would normally do is draw a box through the entire thing and grab all four sides of it, or all four edges, and then hit connect. And we've added a loop. That's one way to add a loop. The other way is the Swift Loop tool up here, which we didn't go over yet, which just adds a loop really quickly wherever we decide it is, not in any particular place like halfway like the other tool did. The Swift Loop is like a faster tool, but it's kind of dirtier. So those are the basic edge things. The only time you're going to use borders is if you have open polygons. You can hit 3 for borders, grab the whole shape, and it'll just grab the open spot. It's pretty helpful. I think Cap Poly is only a border tool. Cap Poly just closes holes. Now you can see here that we've accidentally created a imperfect object, so I would need to go into my vertex mode, grab those, and then hit connect. And now I have it correct again. Or if I want to remove that edge completely, we can go back to what we did before. We can double click the edge and remove it. Now it's something we haven't gone over just yet, but if you single click an edge loop, this is a loop, double click, it'll grab the whole thing, and then again control backspace will remove it. So like for instance, edge rings go like parallel to each other. So like if I grab this, I can select a ring like that. That's an edge ring. An edge loop goes this way. This does matter. Now you see me using some tools up here that we haven't quite gone over yet, but these are selection tools. It'll select rings and loops, and dot ring, which just means like a ring with gaps in it. It's a pretty advanced selection mode that we'll use a little bit. There's also these down here. Select similar and select outline. There's some pretty cool stuff in here. But remember, this is just a primer, kind of a first exposure. So I'm going to, for example, grab all this and remove it. It's always control backspace that I'm using. So all that crap I just cut in there with Swift Loop. Double click, hold control, double click, alt backspace. Also, if that grid is getting on your nerves, just hit G for grid. You can turn that off. All right, so we'll go into polygons real quick and just go over this stuff. We're pretty close to the end of the here's everything in Max in 5 minutes. Well, more like an hour. Day 1 lecture. Sorry, just drinking some water. Okay, so edit polygons. We can insert vertex into the middle of a polygon. I never do this. Some guys that I know from the old days of games, I have some friends that worked on stuff like Hexen and stuff. I worked with them in Madison, and they would actually build organic models this way. Just kind of poke, we call this poke facing, to create organic shapes. It's an interesting kind of old school way of doing things. I don't do it. But extrude, this is a proper use of extrude. Like this is good extrude. So that's what extrusions are. You're gonna pull a piece out of another piece, and you can build something sort of complicated out of this, you know. Make a huge mess very quickly. That's what extrusion is. And you normally only do it on polygons. So outline, I've never used because honestly it just seems like scaling one face. So maybe I'm not using it right. I don't know. Bevel, on the other hand, I use a lot. So what bevel is an extrusion and a taper. So whereas outline just kind of did this function. So again, we're in bevel settings. So remember, we always have the tool, which we can click on, and that allows us to do a dynamic version. So for bevel, it would give us the extrusion, we let go, and then we pick the taper. And in bevel settings, it gives us a spinner for the extrusion height and the taper. It's a fun tool. Normally, though, I would probably, to be honest with you, I would just extrude and then switch to scale and then set my scale and my height. That's a much more normal way of modeling. Inset. This tool is amazing. Inset, Maya doesn't have. How people do inset in Maya is they do an extrusion on 0 and then they scale it. And it creates this little picture frame of polygons, which is called an inset. So in Max, all you do is go to inset and then you can kind of just create one. It's a very good tool. Normally, like if we're going to do an extrusion, we'll do an inset first, something like that. All right, so let's show you a fun little trick here for the next tool, which is bridge. If we do an inset on both of these polygons, so let's make sure you can do this with me. Click, select, hold Control, click, select. We're going to inset settings. We're just going to go with the default settings because we don't care. And if we hit bridge, it'll just punch a hole through our mesh. What it's doing is building a bridge between each edge. This one, this one, this one, and this one. All the way through, just punches a hole straight through. Very cool. Flip, you're reversing the polygon. Rarely will you want to use this for anything good. Normally it's because your mesh got screwed up. We'll go over other stuff like hinge from edge and all that later, but these are basic modeling things. I just wanted you to see before we jump straight into stuff. Again, up here, the only things I really wanted you to see is Swift Loop, which cuts loops, which means those are now separate polygons, which we can manipulate. So Swift Loop is important. I don't think anything else is necessarily that important to show you in the primer before we do our first model. I just like to hit people over the head with how in-depth this stuff is. Then we're going to build a model, and then we're going to start over and do a more slow model with UVs and textures and stuff. So that's all for the first section. We'll see you in part 2.